Hi guys, so here we are at our last lecture, and we're going to focus here on behaviorism and personality. I feel like I have to give a little disclaimer here, which is that I struggle a bit with the idea of a simply behavioral way of explaining personality. And I think that behaviorism has something to offer here, and that behavioral principles certainly have a role in explaining personality. But from a purely behavioral point of view, there's not a lot of openness to other perspectives. So I just kind of give you that as a grain of salt. So let's dive in. For to really understand this content, though, it really is going to be important that you refresh your memory a little bit about what classical conditioning is and how it works, and what operant conditioning is and how it works, and also what social learning is and how that works. So I'm not going to go over the very basic material about that, but we will kind of touch on each of those as we move through here. So I'd really like you just to take a moment. We can talk about this more when we're online together, but just take a moment to think about the question of whether changing someone's behavior and their behavior only has changed their personality. So if you could change someone's behavior, would that result in a change of personality for them? And I'm not telling you what the answer is to that. I really want you to think about what you believe about that. And maybe it would help to think about also one of the people you wrote about this semester, so papers 1, 2, or 4, so your friend, one of the invincible characters, etc. And ask yourself what could be changed about this person's behavior that would result in change that you would consider personality change, or what could you change about their behavior that you don't think would mean that their personality was different, that it was just their behavior that was different. And you could take a few minutes maybe to think about that, and maybe think about it in a way that allows us to come back to it for discussion. But I think the most basic question is to ask yourself, what do behaviorists focus on? And the answer to that question really is embedded in the title behaviorism, because behaviorists only focus on behaviors. So we've been defining personality as ongoing patterns or consistent patterns of behavior and experience. And behaviorists are going to just hang on to the first part of that they're not going to find internal experience is useful in defining or discussing personality, and are really only going to focus on those behaviors. And so when we think about the 4 kinds of data that we talked about, right, they're really not going to be so interested, for example, in self-data. They're not going to be interested in your own internal experiences. They're going to be very interested in behavioral data. They might be interested in informant data, but only so much as that's commenting on behaviors. And so in this chapter, we're going to talk about 4 different types of learning, behavioral learning, that is interesting to behaviorists in thinking about how personality develops. So habituation, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning. And the one you're probably least familiar with here, perhaps, is the idea of habituation. That this is just the idea that when we say we habituate to things, what we mean is that we get used to it and stop responding to it in the same way. So if a good example of this might be if you are constantly, so I don't know if you can hear, can you guys hear those frogs in the background? So if you can, we live on a pond, and there's peepers. The peepers are pretty loud, and they start the minute the sun starts going down, and they'll go late, even through the night, certainly until about midnight or so. I don't hear them unless I pay attention to them. They're background noise. I've habituated to them. If you came here, right, if you were going to spend the night someplace for the first time, those peepers might actually feel like noise that was disruptive to you, that you couldn't stop paying attention to them. But I've lived here for 26 years, and they do not feel like noise to me. I don't pay attention to them much at all unless I am deliberately noticing them, right? I've habituated to them. I don't have a strong response to them anymore, right? So let's listen again. I'm not sure if you can hear them. When I listen to the video, I'll find out. So, I want you to think about how habituation might connect to emotional responsiveness, to extroversion, to openness. You might imagine, for example, that if you, if even an introverted person has to go into social settings over and over and over, that they might over time simply get more less reactive to social settings. They might look more extroverted, and that they might look more comfortable because they aren't having the normal aversive response that they might have had before. So that's one way, and we can talk more about that together. Remember that classical conditioning is learning through association, right? So that's Pavlov's dogs, where the dog learned to associate the sound of a bell to food, and then he wound up drooling, salivating to the bell the same way that he used to the food, right? So you want to hopefully remember that very classical conditioning um, example. And I want you to think about how this might affect the development of neuroticism or anxiety, how it might affect introversion or extroversion. So, for example, if you could imagine somebody who every time they were in a social setting, there was something difficult about that social setting. It was overwhelming in some way. It was unfriendly in some way. So if they've had lots of experience where they've gone into a party and nobody has talked to them, you could imagine that then they avoid going to parties because they associate being in a party with being lonely or being socially ostracized, right, or uncomfortable in some way. And so it's another way that we might develop some personality traits. But by far, I think, for most behaviorists, the most compelling way of talking about personality development is talking about how operant conditioning might shape it. And remember that operant conditioning is about consequences, so reinforcement and punishment, reward and punishment, and how those consequences shape our behavior, that the consequences that follow a behavior make it more likely or less likely that that same behavior will happen in a similar situation. And it's really easy, I think, to think about what traits might be rewarded or punished. And I would love for you to really spend some time thinking about in your own environment, what traits do you think have been rewarded? So if you think about your family upbringing, for example, thinking about what traits have been rewarded. So I can think about the fact that my father seems to really value my outspokenness, right? That my assertiveness. And it's easy to imagine that perhaps as I was growing up, he also valued it and therefore would reward that in some ways. And I don't mean that he would pay me, but that he might look proud, he might smile, he might give me social rewards for that. You can imagine somebody who is more emotionally expressive who has gotten rewarded, that every time they cried, somebody would take care of them, or if they expressed anxiety, somebody would take care of them, and that would reward those behaviors. Um, you could also imagine that those same behaviors might be punished and therefore become less a part of ongoing personality. It could also think about how there might be patterns of reward or punishment for certain behaviors or traits that might be different, certainly between families, but even across cultures. So when we think about certain cultures that are more emotionally expressive or less so, if you think about certain cultures that might be more extroverted or more introverted, that they, that they that might be about what's generally rewarded or punished in those cultures. And then lastly, we come to social learning. And social learning, right, has its roots in Bandora's work, Bandora's Bobo dolls, where a child watched other children beat up the Bobo doll and get rewarded. And then that child who watched, when he or she was given the opportunity to play with the Bobo doll, they were more likely to beat up the Bobo doll if they'd seen people get rewarded. And so social learning isn't just about watching, it's also about what we often call vicarious consequences, or getting consequences by watching through someone else. What vicarious means by watching somebody else get consequences. So vicarious punishment, vicarious reinforcement would be examples of those. And so we watch other people, and then that, right, we see them get rewarded for being more open. We see them get punished for being more emotionally expressive. And then we change the likelihood of engaging in that behavior ourselves based on what we've seen in terms of the behavior and the consequence of that behavior. But Bandura also talked about reciprocal determinism, right? Reciprocal meaning back and forth, determinism meaning what is um, creating or causing something to happen. And so this triangle and the arrows that go in both direction, the way to understand this is that any one of these could be influencing the other. So personal factors like your genes, for example, might be affecting what happens in your environment. So that if I am very outgoing, I might draw people to me by how outgoing I am, right? And so that affects the environment I find myself in, and I find myself surrounded by more people. But the people in my environment also are going to affect how my genetics, sorry about that, guys, that the people in my environment might affect how my genetics get expressed. In addition, right, my genetics shape my behavior, but the ways in which I behave might also then circle back and affect my biology in some way. And personal factors aren't just biology, but that might be a big piece of it. And then environment and behavior, right? Our environment shapes our behavior, but our behavior also shapes our environment. And so round and round we go, where they're all influencing each other all of the time. So hopefully all of this kind of fairly quick discussion complements your reading of the behaviorism chapter nicely. And then we'll be able to discuss the things that you want to discuss more, the questions, things of interest when we talk online.